Hi everyone, so I'm Lucille. I'm in charge of culture events at the Alliance Française de Manchester. For those who don't know the Alliance Française, we're part of an international network promoting French language and French culture. And so today, as Xavier mentioned it, we are delighted to welcome Amanda Babington. So Amanda, you are a violinist, recorder player, and musette player. And you're the artistic director of Baroque in the North, a period instrument ensemble based in Manchester. And you also play regularly with many of the leading British European period instrument ensembles, as well as with chamber ensembles. I could cite AB 24, as well as Fourth Company, or Aberdeen Early Music Collective. And you are also a visiting performance fellow at Aberdeen University and director of the University of Manchester Baroque Orchestra. You have given master classes at various universities, and you're also a lecturer at the Royal Northern College of Music. And that's not all. You have also published various articles on Handel, but more recently, your research has focused on French Baroque music and the musette. And your debut solo musette album will be released in 2022. So some of you might know what the musette is, or maybe you're wondering what it is, because most people know the musette as the bal musette and not always as the actual musette instrument. A bal musette was an informal sort of dance hosted in bars, restaurants, dance halls, because people were looking for easier and faster steps and for a dance that didn't require a lot of space, and it nearly always featured accordion. But before that, the musette is an instrument. And so you will have the chance today to hear this rare instrument and to know more about its history. So again, thanks a lot, Amanda, for being here, and thanks a lot to all for being here. And don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucille. And that's an interesting point about the bal musette, is that originally the dances were accompanied by musette. And then there was an influx of emigres from the Auvergne to Paris who brought their accordions with them that changed it into what we know today. So the original instrument was this instrument here, and I show you on the screen the main chanters or chalumeau. It has also a sack like this and drones. And then the air comes not from the mouth, but from bellows, which are quite hard to see on the screen there. This instrument features in Mersen's Harmonie Universelle in 1636 to 37. And it's first mentioned in L'État de la France in 1661. So that was the sort of the kind of court circular, what was happening where. And it's mentioned there as an instrument d'écurie. So these were mainly open air instruments, hence the reference to the stable. But some of the instruments in that group also played in the chambre and the chapelle, so they were indoor instruments as well. And although it's a bagpipe, you'll hear later on that the sound is not so great as maybe the Highland pipes. So you can imagine it indoors. However, its origins are like all other bagpipes, they're pastoral. And its transition to a high art instrument is really shown by the first treatise that was devoted to it. And that was published in 1672 by Bourgeon de Scalerie. And in this treatise, Bourgeon really describes how to play the instrument. First of all, he describes the mechanics of the instrument, and then he describes how to play it and includes examples at the end. So I thought I would begin by playing to you some of the short dances and songs that appear in this method by Bourgeon de Scalerie. It contains a few bronzes, so this is the early repertoire of this musette. once it became part of the sort of high art culture rather than just a shepherd instrument. So there are several branleurs I will play you two. And then bourgeon also includes some songs, which mean that we know that people would sing, they would accompany themselves whilst singing. And I'll attempt to show it on the screen as I play. Okay, that was just tuning. So that is some of the earliest repertoire, and it's worth mentioning at this point that the instrument had quite a short life as a high art instrument for reasons that will become obvious later on. But we can really say that its life as a high art instrument was limited to about 100 years. And it's worth bearing this in mind as I talk through the types of repertoire and the size of the repertoire. So before I do that, I'll just describe exactly what you were hearing there. So you have here the chalumeau. If I detach it, you can see it better. This particular one is made of ivory, and you see it has a mixture of keys and holes and it has further keys at the side, and then also round the back. So your fingers and thumbs are kept very busy. Inside each of the chalumeau, there is a double reed, a bit like you might find on an oboe or bassoon. And I'll just unscrew this so you can see here. So each chalumeau has one of those. And in fact, when the musette started out, it only had one chalumeau, so just the grand chalumeau. And so that was a development that took place in the late 17th century. You then have the drone shuttle here. Now, the shuttle system for drones is not unique to musette at all. In fact, the musette's closest living relatives both employ shuttle drones, and these are the Northumbrian pipes and the Irish Ellen pipes. And inside there are further reeds. This particular instrument has only 3 drones. It should have 4, but the fourth one doesn't work. And you tune the drones by sliding these here, and so that will make it sharper or flatter. Some instruments historically have up to 6 drones, but the system is the same. So inside there are whole sort of tunnels bored that create the drones. The drones can be tuned to C and G, and D and G. So you can play in those 2 keys if you're familiar with musical terms there. And sometimes you might have an E drone as well. The bass, the dessus, and so on. So then you have the bag, which I'm not sure I can fit it all in the screen, but it is shaped like this, and this is where the chalumeau can go. In fact, I'll just put those back in. And then you have the porte-de-vente here, which is simply the tube that carries the air from these bellows. And you can see best from the back, actually. They're a bit like an accordion, this type of bellows. And so my right arm does this, whilst my left arm controls the bag itself. Again, bellows-blown bagpipes are not uncommon. So I mentioned that the instrument was developed during the 17th century, and it was developed mainly or particularly by 2 families, 2 dynasties we might call them, whose members both played and made musettes, and these were the Chédevilles and the Hotetaires. They both worked at the court in France at Versailles, and Jean Hotetaire was responsible for the second published treatise on the musette. And this is quite interesting because we have these 2 methods, these 2 treatises, which bookend the musette's life. So we see it in its early stages, and then at the end, towards the end of its life, we see it in its most developed form. This is a sort of fairly standard size of musette, but you can get also musette d'amour, which are slightly bigger and play a third lower, and then you can also get the petite version, which plays roughly a tone higher. And we know that they existed at different pitches as well, which in the world of historically informed performance and early music is quite common. We know that different pitches existed all over the world, so there was no common pitch, just as today actually it still varies slightly, so that's not unusual. And they tended to be made from what they made today, really, ivory sometimes. Obviously that's not used so much today, with handmade silver keys, again still handmade today. The reeds also handmade, fortunately not by me but by the makers, and then cowhide for the sack. So I'm going to share on my screen now some slides, and the further musical examples will be a mixture of existing musical examples that I had, really. I just would like to point out that there are a myriad of different ones. So some of them are just my own recordings that I made during lockdown last year. Some of them are recordings from exams that I did. And then some are the first edits from my solo album. So I'll just share my slides. Oh, could you enable participant screen sharing, please?
Yeah. Is it okay now?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. So the person most responsible for the musette and its repertoire and its rise to prominence as a high art instrument was Louis XIV. He was well known for his love of the pastoral, and he's really responsible to a large extent for the musette's popularity. Louis XV also, but really it was Louis XIV's particular love of pastoral soirees, where he apparently would dress in his peasant costume and sometimes bring sheep into Versailles to make the sort of rustic scene. Of course, his peasant costume was still made of silk and probably a lot cleaner than most peasants. But still, he liked to dress the part. And Musette probably featured in those evenings. And he might have heard something like this. This is the Marche de Bergère. So thanks to Louis XIV, thanks to Louis XIV, the musette featured in the sort of daily life at the court of Versailles, and we see it particularly in the musique de chambre as labelled to sort of accompany the daily activities. We have music for the lever, for example. I'm not quite sure that, I guess being woken up by musette could be quite pleasant. I'm not sure about it as an instrument to send you to sleep, but there is also music for that. And the style that we see initially is transmuted from the kind of rustic background. So we see it in the old French style as simple dance-based suites. And so I'm going to play you 3 movements from an anonymous suite that's titled Amusement de Chambre. So we know that this kind of music would have been heard around the rooms of Versailles. And you'll hear a minuet, an air gai, and the tambourin. The tambourin was a very popular dance and features in many of the suites from the time. So there you get an idea of the kind of style and also of the sound world. And it's a sound world that amongst instruments of the time, Baroque violins, we have the famous 24 violons du roi that existed at Versailles. We have Baroque oboes, horns, trumpets. It's very different to any of those instruments, mainly because of the drones, which you can hear sounding all the time. Thanks to the patronage of Louis XIV, composers basically fell over themselves to write for the instrument, seeing it as his sort of personal favourite. And so we really see a boom in the composition of works for this instrument. Of course, it was the royal and aristocratic connections which possibly contributed to its demise towards the end of the 18th century for obvious reasons. But it also meant that we're really left with this vast body of work for such a short lifespan and for one instrument. So I'm just going to show you an overview of the number of composers that wrote for it. There we go. Don't worry if you can't read all the names there. It's just to give you an idea. My research so far has uncovered each of these names, and you'll see from the list that some of them have a little bit of detail and others only a single name. And to my surprise, what I've discovered is that actually very little is known about many of these composers, and yet they wrote for this one instrument. They wrote for other instruments as well, but actually it's, I think, very telling that a composer who has been since forgotten about would have written for this specific instrument, and it shows really the popularity of it at the time. These are all composers that I've termed minor composers because they only wrote one or two pieces for the musette, or perhaps the instrument is not named as the first instrument. This is very common for publications at the time. They'd be named for musette or violin or recorder, basically to increase the market for them. So you have these composers, and then you have also other composers here, this, again, substantial list, who all composed more than two pieces for musette. They were composed specifically for musette, or at least named it first on the publication. And that's significant in itself because it tells us that composition for musette was not a novelty for these composers. It was part of their sort of bread and butter. Composers like Boismortier, for example, actually didn't need to write to any sort of public taste. He had a very nice living just selling music, writing and selling it. So he wasn't influenced by any particular patron, for example. So it's by following these kind of leads that we know that the instrument really played a central part in France at the time. So I thought what we'd then do is just have a quick look at the genres here, because that's the other interesting point in that the music written for musette covers all of the main genres. So we see various concerti, often virtuosi players would have played them. We know that the players such as the chefs de ville and the hottateurs were very virtuosic on the instruments. The same goes for the solo sonata repertoire. We also see a lot of amateur music, particularly chamber music, in various combinations for different instruments. And we know that it was written for the amateur market because it mainly only uses the grand chalumeau, the petit chalumeau being a slightly harder, maybe the second stage of learning for the instrument. We also see the instrument accompanying the voice in cantatas, and we see it featured in operas. It's worth bearing in mind that opera in France was governed, well, all music really, but specifically opera too, was governed first by Lully, and then a long time after his death by Rameau. And it's significant, therefore, that they both write operas that include musette. And that spans a lot of its history. So it's significant because opera really reflects the public taste throughout the 18th century and the end of the 17th century. So I'd like to play you some examples of each of those genres. We're going to start with a concerto not by Hotteterre or Chedeville, but by a composer called Jacques-Christophe Naudot, who again is not very well known today, even in early music. And what's interesting about a lot of the concerti is that they're not written for musette and orchestra as we'd expect a concerto to be played today, but as you can see on the screen here, for combinations such as flute, violin, cello or bass viol, and harpsichord. So this is the first movement of this concerto. So there you see actually what's a very Italianate example there, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But next I'm going to play you just some very short examples to show you some of the combinations of instruments that were used in chamber music. There are lots of duos and trios. One of the things that I used last year's lockdown to do was to explore some of these using a bit of modern technology, as you'll see. This is where it's easier, greener and cheaper to play with another musettist when you can just record yourself. So we'll start with, oh no, not that. This one, in fact, is very handy being a violinist for this piece because I could see how it sounded by playing it together. So these are just short clips, but to give you a flavour of the kind of how it sounds with other instruments or another musette. then again, and then here is an example of with two musettes. And you might have also been able to hear in the background my toddler. Sorry about that. And then here's the final example of a slightly more boisterous movement. And there you'll have heard there the quite present bass, and that's because that particular instrument, that's my instrument at a different pitch. That one has 5 drones, including the bass drone. So I mentioned it, the instrument being used in cantatas, and quite often, sorry, wrong. Got ahead of myself there. Quite often it's used to represent itself, either as part of a pastoral scene or as a direct reference. And this is one where the musette is referenced in the text, though not necessarily this portion. So I mentioned, well, first of all, the operas, and I just made a list here just to give you an idea of the sort of ubiquitousness of the musette across genres. So we have our two famous protagonists. They're famous because they had a sort of outright war between their supporters. Lully, of course, predated Rameau slightly. So Rameau won in the end because he was younger, and really had a great success after Lully's death. But just simply by seeing the amount of composition there, you can see how much time those two composers devoted to the musette. And it wasn't just a fad for them. We see it then reflected in the works of other composers there. So we see musette across all of the genres, written for by both major and minor composers, celebrities at the time, as well as those who possibly weren't that well known anyway. And there's one final detail that really cements its place as a central instrument of the time, and that's the reflection of taste in musette repertoire. So the early works reflect French style, as I mentioned, the dance-based suites. And then as the 18th century progressed, we start to see across French music an Italian influence creeping in. So we see the use of sonata form, of things like cadenzas that you heard a little bit of. And then one piece that really represents that sort of sense of Italian mania that hit France is the next piece that you're going to hear one movement from. This is published as a keyboard sonata by Scarlatti. In fact, it's not at all. It's a sonata for musette, and it wasn't at all written by Scarlatti. It was written by Nicolas Chedeville, who rather naughtily has previous form before this for publishing under other composers' names. He also published a set of sonatas as works by Vivaldi, thus sort of capitalizing on the popularity of both composers and the Italian style. This is a very Italianate piece in both its form and style. But at the same time, it shows the musette's kind of flexibility, because despite the fact that the instrument is unchanged between, say, the early branlers that I played at the beginning and this piece, the writing is very different, as you'll hopefully hear. So this is the third movement from Scarlatti's or Chedeville's sonata. Now, Louis XIV wasn't the only royalty to know about, potentially play, hopefully, and certainly enjoy Musette. My research recently has been, as far as I've been able to during the pandemic, centred around this instrument in the West Highland Museum in Fort William. It was an instrument that was bought in the 1830s at the sale of Cardinal York's effects. This was Henry, the brother of Charles Edward Stuart, otherwise known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender. And this instrument is said to have belonged to Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. I haven't discovered any evidence yet that Bonnie Prince Charlie played them, but Walter Scott said that Bonnie Prince Charlie had several sets of pipes. He doesn't specify what type, unfortunately. There is also another musette in the National Museums of Scotland, and that one is also said to have connections to Cardinal York. And so one possibility is that both brothers had a musette. They're different types, they weren't sort of part of a pair or anything. The one in the National Museum of Scotland is made of wood for a start, rather than ivory. But it's a very interesting trail, which I'm enjoying exploring, if albeit a little slowly. I would like to think, given that the brothers were known to love music, I haven't found any reference to them yet, unfortunately, of them actually playing musette. But we do know that Bonnie Prince Charlie played cello. And so if Cardinal York maybe also had a musette and possibly played it, they might potentially, and I'm being highly speculative here, they might have played one of these pieces. Oh, actually, before I go on to that, we do know that Bonnie Prince Charlie was associated with musette thanks to engravings such as this, which this is a satirical piece that shows Bonnie Prince Charlie with the musette. That gives you the reference to the Jacobitism. You'll notice he's wearing a French beret. This is a reference to the French connections, to the Old Alliance. And when you see the same engraving in other circumstances, you also see it with a sword lying on the ground, showing his, well, sort of poking fun a bit at his campaigns. And he has a rather sort of simplistic expression, shall we say, which was intended, again, to poke fun at him. Some of these engravings are notably sort of filed in satirical sections, so we know that that's what the intentions of the engravers were. But returning to my other point about the two brothers playing together, I like to think that maybe there's a bit of sort of sibling music making, perhaps playing one of these amusements written by Colin Charpentier, no relation, as far as I can tell, to the more famous Antoine, but again, a composer about which I would like to find out more. The recording you're going to hear has another sibling link in that it's me playing with my sister, who is conveniently a cellist. So this is just the overture from the Premier Amusement by Charpentier. So just to round off, and I'm aware we've gone over time, sorry about that. This instrument wasn't rediscovered until the 1960s, which is quite extraordinary, really. So it was last heard at the end of the 18th century and then lay totally undiscovered until the 1960s. And so it's a real latecomer to the sort of general picture of the early music revival, which means that there is so much more still to be learned. We have some excellent makers, not many, but what they lack in quantity, they make up for in quality. And there are various people across the world who are busy finding out things about this instrument and about the repertoire. So it's a really exciting sort of area for someone like me who both performs and researches. And one that it's been a real pleasure to share with you. And thanks to the Alliance Française for inviting me tonight to give this talk. And so it just remains to say thank you, and that if you want to follow more of this Musette journey, if you subscribe at baroqueinthenorth.com, you won't be inundated by emails, but this allows you to keep up to date with developments.
Thank you very much, Amanda. This is fascinating, and we have some questions in the chat. Alan Paul is wondering, how can one acquire one of these fabulous instruments?
Well, there's a bit of a waiting list. There are really two and a half main makers. The half being Remy Dubois, who was one of the original rediscoverers, but he's mostly retired now. There's a maker in Belgium, Bart van Trooyen, who makes and services my instruments. And then I believe there's also Nicolas Rousier in France. As far as I'm aware, they're the only makers. If you go to the musettesociety.com, you can find Bart van Trooyen's contact details there.
Jessica is wondering, were there specific features of the sound of the musette that composers try to highlight in their compositions?
That's a really interesting question. When I came first to this instrument, in fact, I came from an unusual path in that most of the other players of this instrument are bagpipers of another type of bagpipe. But I came to it as a classically trained musician who specialises in music from this period. And I was really surprised to find that the music written for it is not specific to the instrument and tends not to draw out any of its particular features. You would think that they would play to its strengths, but in fact they just write the music that they write for other instruments and ignore the drones, which is quite funny sometimes, because when it modulates out of the key of the drones to someone who hasn't heard it before, it can sound very funny. And I discovered this playing with an organist who had never played with the musette before. And when we got to a bit where we started in the key of G major and we got to B flat major, it sounds very odd against the drones in G and C. And he fell about laughing because he said, this just sounds wrong. So it's very interesting that they actually write really against the instrument in many respects.
Thank you. And the next question will be from Anne Isaac. She's wondering if this lovely instrument is still not used in Brittany during their local festivals.
I think it probably is, and that's purely because I know one of the Belgian players of this instrument goes to Brittany every year on holiday, and so I strongly suspect that it may well be used there. But Brittany also has its own regional pipes as well, and so it might be those pipes would definitely be played at the festivals. In fact, France has a really rich diversity of bagpipes for every region. It's very interesting.
And John Miken is wondering if there is a recognized pedagogy for the musette.
Not really, no. There are only the two treatises that we have. And then I think everyone pieces it together themselves, maybe with some additional knowledge about the drones and the, I mean, things like the fingering, for example, are specified in the treatises, and they're very similar to other bagpipe fingering in that it's what's called a closed fingering. So if I just illustrate with the chalumeau, um, if you're familiar with other wind instruments, most of the time they use open fingering, which means you just add fingers and take them away. But with bagpipes, they use a system where you start with all of the fingers and you lift them off one at a time to make individual notes so that you only have one hole open at the time. And in between, to create the articulation, you go back to the closed, all holes closed, which on this instrument creates a G. So you always have a G sounding between every single note. If you want it to be a smooth legato line, you only touch the G very briefly. But if you want it to be very separate, very staccato, then you spend much more time on the G. And for a player of any other wind instruments, that's very strange because it's the total opposite to what you do on an instrument like, say, recorder or oboe or clarinet or anything like that.
And how did you learn it yourself? Did you learn it with this treatise or?
No, it was really, it was a strange journey because when I finished my PhD a few years ago, I thought, oh, I could have a hobby. And I think the moral of the tale is that musicians should never have a hobby because it always turns into an obsession. So I thought I'd learn bagpipes. And it's not that unusual because I grew up in Scotland and I regretted not having learnt them at school. But I thought, actually, because I live in a semi-detached house in Manchester, I shouldn't really learn the Scottish Highland pipes because they're very loud. And much as our neighbour likes us practising, I'm sure there is a line somewhere. And so I heard some Northumbrian pipes being played at my friend's wedding. And so I thought I might learn those. And then I did a bit more research and I thought, oh, I could learn some pipes that maybe fit with my own area of expertise. So I settled on Musette. But what I didn't realise was that it would take me 18 months to find a set for sale. And then I'd have to go to France for lessons initially. So I started with a teacher, Jean-Christophe Maillard, in Toulouse. And I used to go once a month for lessons. And then very sadly, he died suddenly. And the only other place that I could find a teacher was in Belgium. And so I ended up doing another master's degree in Belgium, studying them there. And actually, it's the kind of instrument that is much nicer learning with other people. So I was quite lucky to have a small network in Belgium with whom I learnt not just about the instrument and the music, but also about the making of it and how to maintain it and that kind of thing, which turned out to be really great.
Mark is wondering if your instrument used today is a replica of an older one, or is ivory still the choice of preference, and if that is problematic for makers?
Yes, it is very problematic, but ivory is not really the choice today, especially because of the restrictions, and especially for UK musicians now. I had to get, because of Brexit, I had to get a musical instrument certificate in order to take this instrument out of the UK. And it's extremely difficult to get the certificate because you have to try and prove the provenance of the ivory. You have to prove that it predates 1948. So for many reasons, actually, wood is the choice of preference. But we have historical models in both wood and ivory. The actual style of the instrument, this one is a copy of an instrument by Nicolas Chedeville, whose name you've heard a few times. And makers can tell, actually, what these instruments are copies of, because they get to know every little turn, each of the sort of the way that the keys are molded, things like the details at the end of the petit chalumeau and also the bell at the end. Apparently that is a real sort of giveaway. The shape here tells you which instrument it's copied from. And there are quite a few instruments in museums across the world for them to copy.
And Alan is wondering if the player lifts up only one finger per note.
Yes, that's right. So that's the closed system of fingering. And that was one of the most difficult things actually I found as a recorder player. Many of the notes are similar. So on recorder, if I wanted to make the note C, I would have these three fingers on. On Musette, if I want to make the note C, it's kind of the same place in the instrument, but I have to just lift that finger instead. So I kind of had to turn my brain inside out a little bit to learn the fingering, but yes, it's just one note, one finger for each note.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions. But thanks a lot, Amanda, for this wonderful lecture. I think it was very interesting, and it's really great to have the chance to hear these instruments. Yeah, would you have something more to add?
No, just again, thanks for listening. This instrument is very rare. It's very unknown, even amongst the historically informed performance world. If you Google Musette, you're most likely to come up with accordion or the bag that goes over your shoulder when you cycle. So I'm going to make it. I'm making it my mission to make it more well known. And so thank you for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the music and the facts around it. And I look forward to maybe perhaps seeing you again at another event. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much to all for being here. Xavier, do you want to?
No, I was just going to say, yes, hopefully next time we could do something face-to-face so we can hear it in real life, everybody of us. So, no, thank you very much, Amanda. So it was really interesting. As a French person, it's true that Musette is that what you gave us tonight. It's a real discovery. So, and no, really, thank you very much for your time and for showing us and for your passion. So, maybe I have one last question. Has it spread to the world? Because we had a comment earlier. The Musette, did it spread? We had a comment from. Let me check. When you played a menuet, someone on a tablet said that the menuet is in the Garcia MS 1772 Mexico City, but I'm not sure. I don't understand. But I've seen Mexico, so I thought, oh, Musette is in Mexico as well.
Yes, well, actually, there's a lot of Baroque music from Mexico, and because of the trade routes. We find music in what we would think of today as being very out of the way places. But we tend to see it on the Hanseatic trading routes. We see manuscripts in places like Lithuania. There's also a Musette actually in a castle in Lithuania. So all along the Baltic coast, we see traces of it. I don't think it was ever quite so popular outside of France, but we certainly see evidence that it was known about, maybe only in one or two pieces in an archive collection somewhere. So probably one person picked a piece of music up somewhere and took it with them. I think that I strongly suspect that question may have come from one of the Musette enthusiasts. There's a Facebook group that I set up, and it has members from across the world, and it's a great place for exchanging information like that. The concert was me, so you can follow me on social media. You can find me on Baroque in the North website. Also musette.com that I set up with the Belgian maker. So yes, if you follow me somewhere in the internet, you'll see where concerts and recordings are to access.
Well, it's really nice to know that there is Musette in Manchester, at least, anyway. So, well, thank you very much. Lucine, do you want to the last word for the evening? And thank you for everybody for joining tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It was really interesting and fantastic. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. And we wish you a very good evening.